Okay, well, welcome to another edition of Call the Doctor with the great Dr. Bob Gill, the campaigning GP. And we're going to be talking about the Epstein Files tonight because there was some interesting, rather remarkable revelations contained within the files, which showed that the various elites, the likes of Bill Gates, Epstein himself, and various others, were planning for a pandemic for 20 years plus before the COVID crisis actually hit. And we know that the elites have, since time immemorial, really made money out of war. It looks like this was another money-making, or potentially another money-making opportunity for them. At least that's the way they seem to be seeing it. I know there's been some reportage on this. There was some various interesting articles on a Substack post that I saw. But have you been following this, Bob? I mean, what's your thoughts about the possibility that the whole COVID issue was staged?
Yeah, hi, Chris. So there has been some talk, particularly on social media, amongst some high-profile medics who have been trying to tell people about the background to COVID. There has been talk for a while that a lot of this was pre-planned. And what we've uncovered with this latest data dump in terms of the Epstein files is a journalist called Thayer G has written a very detailed Substack article where he references the key emails and refers to documents shared on Epstein's email, which outlined how various very big interests, you mentioned Bill Gates, but he also draws in JP Morgan Bank, the WHO, conversations regarding bringing the presidents on board, and the big pharma companies have all been planning since 2011 in terms of how to turn an expected pandemic into a huge opportunity to earn a lot of money. And that's what the article outlines. And he also went on the YouTube host, Kim Iverson, and did a bit more of a simple explanation of what he uncovered.
Right, it's interesting. I mean, I know we spoke during the COVID lockdown, Bob, and I, like millions of others, I don't know whether you did yourself, but had the vaccines, both of them, and indeed a booster. But I just wonder whether or not we were being sold a pup here. I mean, was there really a pandemic, do you think? Or, I mean, was the whole thing a hoax? I mean, I know some people maybe think that. I mean, it seems that we certainly saw lots of publicity about people who died as a result of COVID, and indeed in my own local hospital, some of the medics we were told had succumbed to COVID, and we saw on the news, didn't we? People were really suffering with respiratory difficulties. But looking back now, Bob, these years later, was it a real thing, or was it just overblown? Was it not as serious as they were claiming? I mean, what's your take on it all now?
Well, we do know for certain that there was a huge propaganda effort on various governments and the World Health Organization in drumming up fear about the supposed pandemic. So we were force-fed, horrific statistics produced by Dr. Ferguson, estimating there were going to be hundreds of thousands of deaths. That fed into the propaganda. We had this ticker tape announcement on the BBC every night in terms of how many deaths there had been. And we had a whole year of that ahead of the rollout of the vaccine. Now, the business model that was outlined by Epstein and co. was how to maximize profit from the response to the pandemic. So putting aside the origins of the pandemic, the program was about cashing up. And producing a vaccine on a huge scale, which would then be very profitable to the investors, such as JP Morgan and Bill Gates himself. In fact, Bill Gates has bragged on business programs that he made a 20-to-1 return on investment. He made upwards of £20 billion, him personally, and his Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation profited handsomely. Now, in terms of the Project Fear, well, we can look back and say, what was the death rate of this new virus? And in fact, it turns out it was very similar to a severe case of a flu outbreak. So it wasn't this massive threat to life that Ferguson and co had painted it to be. It was the leading epidemiologists who looked back at the death rates and concluded it was no worse than a flu outbreak. And indeed, the cases of flu that were reported during the COVID, flu actually went down close to zero. So were these deaths actually flu cases, or were they truly this novel virus? There was huge concern about the testing regime, using this PCR test to confirm a diagnosis. Well, the inventor of the PCR test, a Professor Mullins, who was a globally recognized authority on this genetic test that they formed, said it was never designed to be a test for disease. It was only designed as a qualitative tool in experimentation. It was never designed for this purpose. So the PCR test was subverted. We had these dramatic estimations about possible death rate that never turned out to be. And for all intents and purposes, flu disappeared. So we never had a excess death time bomb. That was the propaganda that we were all fed. And what happened, that these interests who were planning a commercialized response to a pandemic back as far as 2011, well, their dreams came true.
Yeah, no, interesting. And I know we were softened up, weren't we, over the years, about the possibility of a pandemic. I remember watching a drama, in fact, on I think it was BBC, about the potential consequences of a pandemic, and there were only a few survivors left in this drama. And then, of course, it might just worthwhile showing this video of various people like Bill Gates and Barack Obama and Anthony Fauci actually talking about the potential of a pandemic. I mean, this, I think, goes back at least to 2015, these recordings.
If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus.
If we get an airborne pandemic, if we haven't built ahead of time some structures to deal with this, millions of people could be adversely impacted.
But also there will be a surprise outbreak. The next administration, that there's no doubt in anyone's mind that they will be faced with the challenges that their predecessors were faced with.
Pandemic prevention and preparedness is going to end up being, whether the administration likes it or not, a priority, a top priority.
Trump is now president. When he faces his first major epidemic, as his predecessors have, he will likely project his impulsivity, xenophobia, and cavalier attitude towards facts to over 52 million followers.
We may yet again have another pandemic, and it is almost inevitable that we will have another pandemic.
Welcome to Event 201.
Of what's looking like it will be a severe pandemic.
A new coronavirus.
Why don't we blow the system up and then say, hey, everyone in the world should get this new vaccine we haven't given to anyone yet?
But it is not too crazy to think that an outbreak of a novel avian virus could occur in China somewhere. We could get the RNA sequence from that and print those vaccines on a patch and self-administer.
What's your thoughts on some of those comments, Bob? Oh, they're interesting, isn't it? They're sort of warming us up, as I was saying just before we showed the video, many, many years ago.
Yeah, so this is an example of predictive programming, getting us used to some serious event in the future. You had various speakers there, including Tony Fauci, who's been at his predominant position in healthcare in America for 4 decades. And of course, he stayed there from the changes in administrations from Obama to Trump. And so he was in a key position to carry on with this narrative. You had other speakers there, including, I believe, people from the WHO, a president, Anthony Fauci, all beating the drum about what we need to be fearful of a pandemic, and also the solution in terms of we need to be ready and we need to have the production capacity to produce a vaccine straight away. From other sources, I've gained knowledge that actually the patent for these mRNA vaccines were ready before the pandemic. Now, you tell me how you could come up with a solution for a novel virus before the virus is out in the public, to be get infected, to get exposed from. So a lot of this really stinks. They also refer to Event 201, which was a simulation. How would various sectors of the response act when called upon in an emergency? And the key figures we've not mentioned so far is the role the media played in drumming up and causing more and more fear. Not only that, not only were they trumpeting the dominant narrative, the loud narrative, they went out of their way to silence and smear voices of skepticism. People who were saying this is lockdowns and vaccines aren't the way to go. Why don't we promote health? Why don't we promote improving your immunity? Why don't we promote taking sensible measures like getting vitamin D and getting out into the sunlight and eating well and trying to lose weight? So all those common sense measures were just not heard of. And all we were told to do was stay locked up in our houses, jeopardize our businesses and our work and our incomes, waiting for a vaccine which was rolled out in warp speed and hadn't been properly tested.
I mean, would you say this was a manifestation of neoliberalism? I mean, we've seen the advent of neoliberalism after Thatcher and Reagan came to power in 1979 and 1980, respectively, where basically the market was king. And it seems that, as we were saying earlier, this is a kind of huge opportunity for big pharma to make, colossal profits. And this is inevitably where neoliberalism takes us to, where, the public interest isn't paramount. It's actually generating additional profits for big corporations, in this case, big pharma.
Yeah, I think, neoliberalism is supposedly handing everything over to the free market, but actually there is no free market. It's a rigged market where the government get into bed with these corporate entities. The people helping the corporations get their way often get a payoff. So I'd call it what it is. It is state corporate corruption. You could call it state fascism. Mussolini termed use this merger of state and corporate interests as fascism. And on the back of that, we were subjected to quite authoritarian diktat, weren't we? We were told, if you get out of your house when we've called a lockdown, you're going to face arrest. If you do not have the vaccine, you might end up losing your job. There was 100,000 health and care workers who were facing the threat of losing their job in a health emergency because they weren't prepared to have this novel vaccine. So we saw the rise of authoritarianism. We saw a supposed pandemic, a health emergency, turned into an opportunity for the state to remove our freedoms and our liberties and for private companies to rake it in.
No, indeed. I think, the comparison with, Mussolini, and, quoting him is absolutely apposite. You're totally on the money there, Bob. But yeah, I mean, just in terms of the authoritarianism, I know that Derbyshire Police, for example, where I'm from, I mean, they were deploying drones to spy on people who were taking the dogs for a walk in the Peak District. I mean, nowhere near anybody, but they were being hauled over the coals for this and slapped with fines and so on. And There's one case where you were allowed, I think, to go for a walk in your own sort of a district or your own area. And again, in my case, there's there's a place called Elveston Castle where people like to check the dogs for a walk, but that's actually in a different local government administrative area, even though it's very close to the city. But because some people were walking their dogs and they were from a place called Spondon in Derby, a suburb of Derby, and it's literally a stone's throw from this place, Elveston Castle, they got pulled over by the cops. They said, "Where are you from?" And they got fined. This was just astonishing to me. And no common sense was used in these sorts of cases. But I was a bit surprised. I don't know about you, Bob, but were you surprised by the fact that people were overwhelmingly willing to go along with this lockdown and all the restrictions that were imposed on the public?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a human psychological default that in times of fear, you look for clarity and you look for authority. And that's what the government relied upon. In fact, most of the experts advising government weren't scientists, weren't doctors, they were psychologists. You had this part privatized entity within government called Behavioral Insights, which were leading the changes in the messaging and monitoring the public response. These were psychologists, so they knew what they were doing, and they knew that fear was key. These reports of innocent people getting arrested whilst walking their dog, the footage of that was needed to be broadcast on our televisions to say, look, this is what will happen to you if you disobey. So it was necessary to maintain people's conformity by having these examples that clearly are entirely crazy, but you needed this fear propaganda to maintain the program.
I mean, and could it have been a dry run for other more sinister actions by governments in the future? I mean, obviously they've had this dry run now. I mean, it's I know some people are fearful of that. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Bob.
Yeah, it was a dry run for so many things. A dry run for accepting an unproven medical intervention, which was jabbed straight into your body. A dry run for how propaganda can be fine-tuned. A dry run in terms of public compliance. A dry run for accepting surveillance software. Remember the COVID app, which was going to alert you if you came next to somebody who had a positive COVID test. So there were so many commercial and governmental interests that were served by this pandemic charade, which in fact did a huge amount of damage to the population. Elderly people were locked up in their homes. The severely ill were left to die without any relatives nearby. So many people lost their jobs or lost their businesses. There was a massive wealth transfer to the super rich. The number of billionaires who benefited directly from government contracts or small businesses going to the wall, shot up. The wealth inequality grew wider and wider. You had the destruction of the educational chances of youngsters, particularly, the children in primary schools having developmental delay, language delay, social interaction being affected. So our governments were willing to damage the public in so many ways. And this was no accident. We can see from other Epstein's email leaks how he was in bed with key characters in our government. And they were sharing confidential information which could be weaponized and turned into a business opportunity for Epstein and his friends, the Epstein class.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder whether politicians were manipulated to take the action that they did. I mean, some, you say, were in bed with these nefarious forces, but Do you think the sophisticated propaganda technique that the elites were deploying in this regard had actually, as well as conning the public, as in that sense, had conned the politicians as well, or do you think the politicians just were on board with this?
Well, let's not forget the parties that Boris Johnson was having while he was pretending to wear a mask at 24 hours a day. He was organizing parties in Downing Street.
Yeah.
There's lots of footage where by public figures were, when they didn't think the cameras were on, were talking without masks. And as soon as the cameras were coming on, they donned on their masks. So there was a lot of performative theater by these politicians. If they were scared to death by their own propaganda, they wouldn't be behaving in such a way. We know from releases in New Zealand, remember the New Zealand Prime Minister was the most authoritarian out of all the Western democracies. But we learned from a leak, or it might have been released after public outcry, that hundreds of politicians sought to exempt themselves from having the vaccine.
Yes.
Now, why was that? What did they know that they weren't telling us?
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, I wasn't a politician, not an elected politician at that time, so I certainly didn't have any inside track information. I'd lost my seat in 2019, just before the pandemic. But I want to move on to another video. But just before I do that, again, just to invite anybody who's got any comments or questions I want to put to Bob, please let us know. Somebody's put a comment in the chat, Bob, in relation to my remark about, and our conversation just now, about neoliberalism, saying it's not just neoliberalism, an attempt at medicalized depopulation. Coronavirus didn't kill people. Midazolam cocktails, I don't know if I can pronounce that correctly, you probably would be able to do better than me, Bob, but anyway, irresponsibly introduced under Matt Hancock, with the expectation that patient dying, no counterbalance against euthanasia, a vaccine weaponized to do serious injury and death. But before I get your response to that comment, Bob, I just want to show this other video, which is, it's about the situation pertaining to the coronavirus in the United States. But I think it's got relevance here. When we talked about, the profiteering big pharma companies and how they certainly cashed in here in the UK. It's an even more sinister scenario in the United States. And given that we've got the Reform Party now, actively, favouring an alternative to a publicly funded healthcare system similar to the United States, I think this video is particularly apposite because of the consequences that can flow from a privatized insurance-based medical system. So let's just play that video if we can.
And what we did initially was a disaster. Frankly, from a legislative perspective, what we did was we actually incentivized murdering patients in hospitals. What we did was we said, if you go to the hospital and you get a positive COVID test, then the hospital gets more money. If you get put on remdesivir, the hospital gets more money. If you get put on a vent, the hospital gets more money. If you die, the hospital gets more money. So incentivizing treating a patient to get better, instead of saying you get more money when this patient's healthy, we said you get more money when they die. What incentive for a hospital system is there to do anything different from that when the protocol's there? The medical boards and all of these groups, listen, frankly, it would take me 3 days to go through all the evidence that I have on corruption throughout the country on all of these guys. We've dealt with protecting doctors from just nonsensical attacks on their license around the country by medical boards whose board members were practicing doctors and nurses who made tons of money off of the existing COVID protocols. When people like Dr. Bartlett had protocols that worked much better. The medical boards have to be reined in a little bit because what they did demonstrated that their interest was more in money than it was in protecting the lives of patients, in my opinion.
Very emotive language there, Bob. Murdering patients because it was profitable to do so. He also, this was at I think it was a Senate hearing in the States. There's a guy addressing the politicians there. But as I say, very emotive language. And he also spoke about the impact on clinicians, on medical staff, which obviously was an issue for people in this country as well. But how do you respond to that presentation, Bob, that guy was making at that hearing?
Yeah, so the speaker was a lawyer, Tom Renz, who has been making a bit of a reputation defending doctors who were prevented from practicing good medicine, doctors who are being smeared or getting their license removed for trying to do the right thing for patients. But what he also outlined was the setting up of perverse incentives within the hospital system in America. So, for example, if you had a positive COVID test, irrespective of what you came into hospital with, you were already worth more to the hospital.
Yeah.
So they were very pro-testing for COVID. And then as people became more seriously ill, if you put somebody on a ventilator who was getting towards the end in terms of COVID, whether you thought they were going to survive or not, the fact that you put them on a ventilator attracted a hefty fee for the hospital. And what we actually discovered was the people who weren't ventilated, who were having their breathing supported without intubation and ventilation, they actually did better and more likely to recover from COVID. So this perverse incentive to a lot of people was a death sentence. They were going to undergo a medical intervention which reduced their chances of survival. And then he mentions a drug called remdesivir, which was known to be a very dangerous drug in any case already. They were using this for the Ebola outbreak in Africa. And the patients who were put on remdesivir had a 50% chance of survival because of the drug. However, they were also justifying its use in COVID to protect the kidneys, I believe it was. And the people put on remdesivir had a higher chance of death. However, that drug prescription generated huge profit for the drug company and for the hospital. So it was done carte blanche. Now, thankfully, those perverse incentives didn't apply in the UK, but unfortunately, a lot of the protocols that America was instituting were blindly followed in this country as well. And, the comment from the listener in terms of midazolam, the use of midazolam, well, just to remind people, midazolam is a respiratory depressant. Morphine-related drugs are a respiratory depressant, and these were being commonly used for people who were finding it difficult to breathe.
Yeah.
So, it doesn't take a lot of brain power to say, actually, this might be a very risky thing to be doing to people who can't breathe already. And this was written down in the UK's NICE guideline to be done for people in nursing homes. So you ended up killing off a lot of nursing home patients by giving these end-of-life drugs to people. And just going back to Bill Gates has created an image of himself as a philanthropist. He's very pro-vaccine in the third world, but actually he had court cases in India and I believe in Africa as well, which highlighted that his intervention with vaccines actually caused more harm than good. And I believe it was a DTP rollout in Kenya, whereby researchers went back and looked at how did the vaccine recipients do, and they found that the people receiving the vaccine the children receiving the vaccine were 5 times more likely to die than the ones that were unvaccinated. Mm-hmm. They didn't die of the diseases that the vaccine covered. They died of other infectious diseases and other medical problems. So that data, when published, showed the devastating impact of imposing vaccines without proper study. And they were also selling the vaccines that were banned in Western countries. So Bill Gates has a long and dubious track record in public health. Yet during the pandemic, he was brought up to sort of savior level. He was on our televisions every time you turned them on, prognosticating on public health measures. You know, this is a guy who dropped out of university, who made all his money by hoodwinking his partner out of his Microsoft shares. And now, you know, he's got sort of almost a saintly a persona, but thankfully this is being significantly damaged by the Epstein revelations.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, there's obviously there's been quite a lot of commentary in this country and certainly in the United States. And there's another interesting video which as a doctor who was very concerned about the way in which the system was being operated, and you know, she suggesting that a substantial number of children were killed as a consequence of, you know, being given the COVID vaccine. I wonder whether we might be able to just play that video quickly, Chris, as well, because I think that's quite illuminating.
The FDA, Dr. Prasad, came out and said the following things. This is a bombshell that our federal government is fessing up. One, they said that these shots killed more children than they saved. Killed more children than they saved. The risk of death from one shot of a COVID shot was 3 in 1,000, and people had more than one, right? If you got the initial, you got 2 shots. That's a risk of 6 out of 1,000. That's unbelievable. That's at least 1,000 times higher than the risk of death to that child from COVID. 1,000 times higher. So first of all, the fact that our FDA said that, amazing. He also called these shots gene therapy. You know the concept of shedding that everybody was wondering about? And I said, yep, sure, certainly seems real to me. Yes, he called them gene therapy. The third thing is he says we're not giving these shots or other vaccines to pregnant women unless we have true data that it really reduces the risk of disease, not just like a numbers, not just when you check antibody titers, but is it actually reducing the incidence of disease? And this is a little story that's gotten buried, but in that same memo, he said that he's going to revise the annual flu shot schedule. This is a really big deal. He actually called the past guidance really flawed. He said uncertain vaccine effectiveness measured in case control studies with poor methods. He's saying they had bad science, junk science that was allowing the flu shot schedule to go on at a $5 billion annual per year in the United States. So they're going to be looking at flu shots too. This is a bombshell story.
I mean, is that an exaggeration, Bob? I mean, it sounds incredible.
I think the main focus of that commentary was mRNA gene therapies, which is what they really are, being given to children. Now, these were, I believe, mandated in the States, so parents weren't given much choice. Now, we know that COVID infection never presented any significant risk to healthy children. You could extend that to anybody under the age of 30, really, to be honest.
Yeah.
There was no evidence of any benefit. Now, you know, normal medicine has a precautionary principle. You do not subject somebody to a medical intervention when you are likely to do them very little good and you might do them significant harm. And there is lots of information, lots of data available now in terms of being published in Japan, in South Korea, I believe in Czechoslovakia, and also in some states in the US, which have definitively shown that the outcomes for vaccinated populations are worse than those that didn't receive the vaccine.
Wow.
And this is particularly a problem in young people. Now, I keep slipping into calling it a vaccine. It was never a vaccine. What a vaccine is to take an element of a bacteria or a virus to make it non-harmful and to inject a fixed dose into the recipient. What the mRNA is to inject a piece of code, a piece of genetic code, which has a totally unpredictable effect in the recipient, such that your body is turned into a factory for the spike protein. the damaging part of the virus, which causes inflammation in your blood vessels and an inflammatory response. You are being given the genetic material to have a totally unpredictable manufacture of spike protein, because how can you predict who's going to make more spike protein, who's going to make less spike protein? And youngsters who have a healthy immune system are more likely than not going to produce a lot of spike protein. Now, the problem with spike protein is it causes clotting, it causes autoimmunity, it causes your immune system to move away from general surveillance and keeping a lid on cancers to being preoccupied by producing spike protein. And that is what has led to the excess deaths in the vaccinated population. And the UK has this data, but is refusing to release it. You know, a group of activists took this issue to court, and the data holding authority has refused to release this information. Why? What have they got to hide? Data from elsewhere has confirmed that vaccination did you more harm than good.
And just perhaps moving to the final part of today's discussion, Bob, I wonder whether you might have any comment to make about Peter Mandelson. We all know now, of course, his very close association with Jeffrey Epstein. But just in terms of how that relates to the National Health Service, I mean, he was, as I understand it, and I think you will know more than me about this, linked to or helped to establish or set up the smooth the way, put it like that, perhaps, for the signing of a very substantial contract with the health service with Palantir, which gave them access to handle, as I understand it, patient data records and so on. And I mean, there is, the significant implications there as well, I think. I mean, do you have any concerns about that at all, Bob? And of course, Wes Streeting, as we also know, after he himself has outed himself as, with his various, very close associations with Mandelson. I mean, this goes very, very deep indeed, doesn't it? What's your thoughts about that? I mean, is that a matter of concern for you, and is it something that we should be worried about as the wider general public? And indeed, as some people are saying, should this contract that was signed with Palantir be now cancelled?
Yeah, so I think it's worth reminding people who are Palantir. Palantir are a company that developed out of the deep state in America, out of a program called Total Information Awareness. And what the powers that be in the US decided was the government can't be getting away with setting up a mass surveillance system, so we will privatize it. And Palantir was born out of that. Palantir is led by a chap called Peter Thiel. Palantir is currently involved in helping Israel commit their genocide. They, along with other big tech companies, are partnering up to try and build the infrastructure to run a mass surveillance scheme where government and big tech can control your data, control your digital ID, and be able to monitor all activities of your life, particularly when they bring in digital currency. Now, the Mandelson connection was, I believe, also revealed via the Epstein emails, that Epstein was helping Peter Mandelson do a deal using his, he's got a private company. I think it's not quite a PR company, but a company to assist private business. And he organized a private meeting with an unminuted meeting with UK government representatives and Palantir, and to agree a $250 million contract providing public services with their data support systems. Now, this is not a way a government should be acting. Certainly no one individual should be having so much power to cook up these deals behind closed doors with no oversight, no public oversight, and with contracts that can be having cast a very, very long shadow in terms of establishing a mass surveillance program using health data as an entry point. This is deeply troubling, and I fully support the calls from various sources in terms of a cancellation of these contracts with a big tech data company with a past history Palantir have.
No, indeed. I mean, and I know there was talk, wasn't there? I mean, just talking about cancelling contracts under the Corbyn period as leader of the Labour Party. There was talk, wasn't there, if there had been a Labour government under Corbyn of cancelling the private finance initiative contracts as well. So I mean, it's not impossible to do, is it? I mean, I think there would be legal ramifications, no doubt, I'm sure, but I mean, is this? I mean, is there precedence in your experience of this sort of thing? Contracts being cancelled like that in the health service.
Well, I think just the way that this contract came about, in terms of the lack of people involved, the lack of minuting of meetings. I think there's enough in terms of what is lacking in due diligence to call into the validity of the contract without much fear of any repercussions. So I think the door is open for cancellation, and I think the door is open for prosecuting Mandelson for criminal charges, particularly around this contract, and also him leaking cabinet information about the bailout of the banks back in 2009-10.
Yes, indeed.
So
yeah.
I'm not sure what our police and criminal justice authorities are waiting for. I'm sure if me and you put a foot wrong, they'd be knocking on our door. Yet Peter Mandelson was given the opportunity to go on the BBC to try and launder his reputation. He was given a space in the Times again to paint a picture of how he's just a innocent bystander in all of this. These people need to be facing justice and prison time.
Yes, indeed. What about just going back to Palantir? I mean, where's Streeting's involvement, or is there any involvement from the Health Secretary in that regard?
Well, I think his main claim to fame is that he was a Mandelson protege. He's been groomed by Mandelson to be very friendly to the billionaire tech oligarchs. We know he's a very close friend of Israel, so he won't have a problem tying up with corporations who have also got a track record supporting the genocide. Although, interestingly, he came out, he released some of his messages condemning the genocide. Yet, on the other hand, he's persecuting medics and healthcare workers who made the same point publicly on social media. So he has a very long track record of dealings with Mandelson. He's trying very hard to distance himself now, but I'm hoping that his reputation is now tarnished by association, because from what I've seen, all his decisions so far in regards to the NHS have been to the benefit of private corporations and not to the benefit of the patients and the people working in the NHS.
I guess all of this, these revelations, Bob, as scandalous as they are, I mean, it's been a wake-up call, I think, for lots of people, hasn't it? I wonder whether you're optimistic that the fallout from this will result in better systems being put in place. And do you have any confidence that the mainstream political parties who are currently represented in the Houses of Parliament are learning the lessons and will make the necessary changes, or are we going to need a completely new broom to bring that about, do you think?
I think the way the main parties are structured, they are beyond repair. You have a system whereby prospective MPs are parachuted in, irrespective of their track record. They may not have a track record. They're parachuted in because they've been screened to be compliant. And all the parties have a very top-down compliance structure. Politicians are not really allowed to have individual opinion or ideology or act or go against the party whip. Otherwise, they face political ruin. So I think the whole parliamentary system, how dubious people are elevated to the House of Lords when they, a lot of people we saw given a place in the House of Lords for being actively destroying Jeremy Corbyn's chances of getting elected. Do we really want people with those track records supposedly representing the public interest? The current structure has been shown not to be not fit for purpose. We need a system where we can attempt to elect genuine people to positions of power, not people who lie through their teeth in opposition, get elected, and then just toe the party line. That system is broken and needs to be replaced.
And what's your thoughts, Bob, perhaps finally, in regards to whether lessons are being learned by the bureaucracy? I mean, we've heard your views on the politicians, but what about the bureaucracy in the National Health Service and the rest of it? I mean, are they, do you think, willing to change, to offer different advice, put pressure on ministers and so on to take a different approach in future, or are they just as badly affected by the whole sort of propaganda agenda and with their snaps in the trough or whatever?
Yeah, I think if you look at the penetration of the Israel lobby in all functions of public life, well, I would say that the neoliberal privatization mentality has infected the senior levels of all our public services, and the people leading those public services have been selected because they either buy into it or they realize it's in their own personal best interest to go along with it. So unless you have a clean political leadership which is going to drive out this disease out of public services, I don't think those incumbents are capable of reforming themselves, because they have to take a calculation that, are they at higher risk of standing up for some principle, or will they just toe the line and make sure they got a secure job and a very handsome pension? And most people will go for keeping their heads down. Yeah,
fortunately, that does seem to be the case. But we just have to keep putting the pressure on, I suppose, Bob, and hope that things will improve. We have to keep hope alive and not be.
No, the hope is that for example, the Workers' Party, your party, from what I'm seeing about the Green Party, they can form a useful electoral alliance, and they only have to say a couple of points at the doorstep. We are not part of the Epstein class. We don't believe in privatization of public services, and they're in. But at the moment, we have a billionaire oligarchy choice of 3 or 4 parties which are quite happy to remain with the status quo. And the combined genuine left need to weaponize what we've learned from Epstein and from the Mandelstam affair and say that these establishment parties are no longer an option for you. And here is the evidence. What more do you need to see?
Well, on that note, Bob, I think we'll close the discussion, and hopefully that will result in an improved situation going forward with our elected leaders. And let's hope we can, build a movement that is capable of offering a credible alternative to the mainstream political parties. Of course, if we can reach that sort of electoral agreement, there will be heaven and earth moved by the establishment to demonize it, to rubbish it, to do everything they can to divide it, because the status quo is incredibly lucrative for them, and they will do everything they can, as we saw when they destroyed the Corbyn leadership. They'll do everything they can to maintain that status quo. So we're up against very strong and powerful vested interests, but there are more of us than them. And if we do unite and put forward a common sense proposition, the people will prevail in the end. And that's what we have to hang on to, that hope. And let's see how things develop over the coming months and years. We'll get a bit of a test, I think, in the by-election in Gorton and Denton at the end of this month. Then, of course, the local elections in May. And that will be another indication of the way in which the political winds are blowing. But there's still quite a few years to a general election when we can affect real and meaningful change. But in the interim, we have to do everything we can, I think, to build that movement, to build that unity, in order to build the good society that everybody wants to see. We can do it. It takes political will to make it happen, and that's what we've got to hang on to. So I think we'll leave it there, Bob. As I say, thanks for your contributions again this evening. Thank you, everybody, for listening and watching this evening. We'll be back next week at the same time. So until then, this is Chris Williams saying bye for now.